Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the Responsible Conduct of Research. It is the third workshop in this series. We're talking about the IACUC and ethical use of animals in research. And I do want to talk about the fact that we also have a scientific communication one. There's two workshops left in that one, and they are next Tuesday and then a couple Tuesdays after that. I also want to tell you that there is a micro-credential that is available in responsible research. So if you're interested, I'm going to put something in the chat. Just email me and you can create your own timeline for when you want to finish it. We're extremely flexible with that. Also, if you missed any of the series and you would like to receive the certificate of completion, which you can receive if you actually attend all of the workshops, or you request the video for a workshop that you missed and you do a short protocol related to the video, then I will get you a certificate of completion a couple weeks past the time in which this series ends. Now, what I want to do is actually introduce our wonderful speaker today. And his name is Dr. Albert Titus. He's an Associate Vice President for Regulatory Support and Professor of Biomedical Engineering in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at the Jacobs School of Medicine, Biomedical Sciences. And his specialty or research focus is biomedical engineering. So I am going to turn this over to Dr. Titus, and he can begin the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today in the next of the series of workshops. I apologize, as soon as I put the slide up, I saw that it's March 24th, 205 rather than 2025. So we're a little behind the times, but hopefully that's my only typo on the presentation. So again, I'm Associate Vice President for Regulatory Support in the Vice President for Research Office. And in this role, what does that even mean? It means that anything that is research compliance reports up to me, and that includes the IACUC committee itself. It includes the Laboratory Animal Facility, or LAF. It also includes things like the IRB, which is the human side of things rather than the animal side. Any other compliance issues that we have to deal with that's related to research comes up through my office. So generally, questions come my way, and then I hand them off to other people who actually know the answers to things. So to get started, I would like to go through, oops, find my pointer, there we go. Go through just what we're going to cover today in today's session. So as we get started, the chat, we're monitoring the chat. So if there's questions as we go along, we'll try to address them. And then if there's none, then we'll address the questions at the end. So to start with is the topics that we're going to talk about. Part one is just is an overview of the framework for understanding the ethical pros and cons of using animals for research and teaching, as well as information about the resources and regulations about the care and use of animals in research. That's part one. Part two, get into some of the regulatory guidelines that define what is an IACUC, or Institutional Animal and Use Committee, often abbreviated as IACUC. Other universities may have a different name. Many use IACUC, others use other names. As well as what is the investigator responsibility. Investigator meaning both the person, the PI, maybe the professor or other research scientist potentially, or a postdoctoral student who's in charge, but also this trickles all the way down to every person who will be involved with using or involved with the animals use as part of their research, including all of the students, whether a graduate student or undergraduate student. And then part three, we cover some of the NIH and National Institutes of Health regulatory principles that are applying these to different projects and theoretical examples. So that'll be kind of part three here's some examples. What do you think the answers are? A little bit of a open-ended quiz on part three, and then part four, just to summarize with some of the references that we have that we can use. And I'll be citing some of those references as we go along. So what are the objectives of today's workshop? Participants, meaning the folks who are here today, who will use animals in research or teaching, you'll receive a background to the NIH and USDA guidelines, regulations, and as well as the accepted practices regarding the use of these animals in research and teaching. You'll obtain an understanding of the multiple roles of the IACUC in supporting research at universities, institutions, and you will understand the elements of a research protocol that serve as the basis for IACUC decisions regarding acceptability of using animals as part of research and teaching, and be able to approach an animal use application form to better convey the rationale and methodology of animal research for IACUC review. I want to just point out here to start with is that in this presentation, if you were working on developing an animal use protocol, one thing, the types of questions that I won't answer are, oh, I'm trying to do this and this. Do you think this will work or that will work? I am not a member of the IACUC. I oversee what the IACUC does, but I do not make decisions about what is acceptable or not acceptable. That is what the IACUC's role is. I can be involved at different levels, but I am not a decision maker on that point. It has to be a separate committee. So I would not be able to provide that information to you about specific protocols, but I can talk about things in general, and we do some examples for that. So part one, as I said, it was a little bit about the background of things. So to start with, the most important, the very, very basic starting point for animal research is that if we are going to be using animals or involving animals in research as well as teaching, and when I say research, I'll also have teaching involved, but just to keep things more compact. The responsible advancement of bioscience, medicine, and other biomedical research has historically depended on the use of animals first and then humans in scientifically relevant and ethically justified research. That's gone on for many, many, many years. And these studies are reviewed. The ones that are involving animals in some way are reviewed by and approved by the IACUC, as we mentioned, the Animal Use Committee, and also IRBs. And the IRBs are for the human side, institutional review boards. Those are the boards that are similar to the IACUC. It's the parallel that looks at human research or research involving humans. And these committees are essentially society's gatekeepers. So as a society, we have determined that this is the process we will use for making these determinations. Because often, very, very often, almost all the time, the FDA, for example, will ask for animal results before approving a human study on, say, a device or a drug or some other treatment. So the FDA says we won't approve this for human testing until you've tested it first in animals. Therefore, we now have to go and say, okay, well, who's saying, okay, we can do this research on animals? So just as a comparison, so we understand and can see the relationship here, we have human subject research on the left, on the yellow, and the animal subject research, which is our focus today, on the right or blue. So if we start off at the very high level at, okay, society has deemed this to be the process, how does that get implemented in practice? That then comes from federal regulations that we have agreed that this is how things should work. And on the human subject research side, there's something called OHARP, or Office for Human Research Protections, and that comes out of the Department of Health and Human Services. On the animal research side, we have two entities. One is called OLAW, or the Office of Lab Animal Welfare at the NIH, as well as the USDA. Institutional oversight then occurs via the IRB on the human side and the IACUC on the animal research side. The accreditation body, well, what is an accreditation body? An accreditation body is a group that the institutions have generally agreed to, and that the federal regulators have said, yes, this is what we will accept, is if you are accredited by these different bodies, then we will say, if you meet what they say is necessary, we will believe that you're in compliance with the regulations that are put forth. So on the human subject research side, we have AHARP, which is the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, but people mostly just say AHARP. And on the animal research side, we say ALAC, or the Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Lab Animal Care. So we have these two accreditation bodies, and let's just look at the animal subject research. So we're leaving the human subjects behind. In animal subject research, ALAC comes and inspects and says, are you doing this? Are you doing that? How are you handling this? How are you handling that? What are your protocols? How do you approve them? How do you handle when things go wrong? Who's checking for this? Who's checking for that? What do the facilities look like? Lots and lots and lots and lots of things. They come, and they actually are coming soon. They come to inspect our facilities and our processes and look at our documentation. And if we pass and we get accredited by them and they say, yes, you could improve this, but everything else looks great, you pass, then what we can say to OLAW is, hey, we have met what ALAC says is needed for accreditation. Therefore, we believe that we are in compliance with, and we will continue to do these things to be in compliance with OLAW and the USDA. And then they are acceptable for that. So they do not come, OLAW and USDA and OHARP do not come themselves to inspect, although USDA can do that inspections for different reasons. But those offices will then say, okay, we trust that you are doing the right things, and because you've been accredited. So once we go to the last point is that we have the accreditation body saying, yes, you're doing the right things. So then when you go to do the research yourself, doing the research on the human subject side, we say, we ask, part of the process is when we're doing research with human subjects is, of course, we have to ask, are you willing to participate in this research study, in this research program, in this questionnaire, whatever this is that we're doing involving human subjects with? And a person has to be presented with all of the necessary information, and the person must be capable of making an independent judgment, an independent decision about that information that's being presented to them to say, yes, I'm willing to participate, or no, I'm not willing to participate. The human that's in that loop has to be able to make those decisions. And if it's someone who is unable to make that decision, then there are processes in place for helping determine whether that person can be involved or not. But in general, a human would have to say yes or no. But of course, when it comes to animals, animals cannot consent. They do not have the ability to say yes or no to participating in a particular study. So where does our right to use animals come from if they do not have the ability to consent? So to protect the animals, what has happened is part of what the federal regulations have developed. The federal agencies such as OLAW and USDA and others, they've established this set of principles for using animals in research and teaching and training. And these principles are what we must follow. So again, unlike human studies, the animals do not have legal rights currently. We can debate that issue, but the animals do not have human rights. Animals do not have the ability to consent, as I mentioned, or withdraw from a study. A mouse or a rabbit cannot say, no, I do not want to participate, or yes, I do. And we certainly know that animals do experience pain, discomfort, and distress, just like humans do. So because of these, and also we know that from studies, we know that animals are able to hide their pain and distress. That's part of what we found is we may be able to see it, but they're also, as a mechanism for protecting themselves, they hide the pain and distress so because of these things all together, we have a legal and moral responsibility to treat animal subject as humanely as possible. Okay, so it is both legal and moral. So is both that there are a set of laws and regulations that have been developed that ensure that we do this properly, and we also have a moral responsibility recognizing that animals are living creatures that experience pain and discomfort, that they do not have the ability to consent or withdraw from a study. So we have to make decisions that are proper. So the key is that we have a legal and moral responsibility. So what it's come down to, as a society, we have decided that we are morally justified in using animals for our needs, but only with due consideration. We must treat them humanely. And again, this is a societal determination. It is not, it very well may be that one person believes one thing and another person believes another thing. But as a society, we have decided that this is what we are, that we can do and we must do, and therefore we must treat them humanely. It is with it is what the Spider-Man, right, is with great responsibility, or with great power comes great responsibility, and that's really what this is about. Therefore, even though we have to justify their use, we have a moral obligation to see that they are given a decent, provided decent treatment, adequate food and water and shelter, and a, quote, lifestyle as close to normal for them as possible. So it's that we are saying we recognize what we are doing. We recognize there is a justifiable need for why we are doing this, but at the same time, we are also have a moral responsibility to treat them as well as possible, the animals that we are involving in our research. So really what it is what we're saying is we really want to disrupt only that which we must disrupt and no more. And we want to do it in various ways. And we do have guidelines, and that's part of what we'll discuss. We have guidelines for how do we make these decisions and what is the right amount of, for example, the right number of animals to use and whatnot. So when you're evaluating the animal use study, so this is something that the IACUC does, but this is also something that the researcher must do as well. Cost-benefit analysis asks that the benefits that we'll derive from the use of animals for our either biomedical or behavioral research offset by the most associated moral costs of using an animal for human purpose. So in other words, that we decided that, yes, we must use an animal for doing some drug development experiments. And why is that? It's because what we've decided is that the benefits of making sure that that diseases do not impact humans, that we can reduce the number of people who die from a particular disease, or that we're able to cure a particular disease, that is very, very, very valuable to us, and therefore we are able to justify it. It is not just, we're not just doing a set of experiments with animals for no real purpose. And the same is true, that's a medical, but there of course is also behavioral research, where we're looking at the behavior of an animal and we're using that to understand better potentially how to treat humans. And the researcher must provide this information to the IACUC, and this is the key, one of the key components of your research protocol, is you must provide the information to the IACUC so it can make this determination. You must be able to say, what are the benefits that offset the cost that are using animals? In the application that you develop for doing the animal research or training or teaching that is evaluated by the IACUC, that is called the project's animal use protocol. So anybody who's doing research must develop an animal use protocol, which is reviewed by the IACUC. So prior to the Animal Welfare Act that was developed, the research community, basically what it was found was the research community failed to meet societal expectations for the proper treatment of research animals. There are many papers that are documenting what went on before the development of the Animal Welfare Act in 1966. Some researchers were treating animals properly, and others were basically treating them like essentially lab equipment, where they could be used and then discarded when done. And that was deemed not acceptable by society. Therefore, what was initiated was the Animal Welfare Act of 1966 that really started how we do modern research, where we believe that animals need to be properly cared for. And the Animal Welfare Act in 1966, it's a law that regulates the treatment of animals in research, teaching, testing, exhibition, transport, and by animal dealers. So the Animal Welfare Act goes beyond just potentially what we're here doing, which is research and teaching, but also covers anybody who deals with the transport of animals, people who are buying and selling animals, putting animals on exhibition, potentially at a circus or other types of events. Could be even a 4-H club or something like that. All of these things are governed by the Animal Welfare Act of 1966, as well as modifications that have occurred afterwards. It gives the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the oversight over the warm-blooded vertebrate animal use, except for birds, rats, and mice, through APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. The AWA regulates animal resources, housing, transport, use, et cetera, et cetera. So the USDA has regulation oversight over these. And then we also see that the NIH also requires us to follow these in different ways. And then in 1985, there was an update, a critical update, and there's been a few modifications, again, smaller ones over the years, but a large update in 1985 directed that the U.S. Public Health Service was able to oversee all vertebrate animal use and research and training, so it moved beyond just warm-blooded. So, for example, it includes frogs and fish, et cetera. And those other animal oversights occur through things like the NIH, again, via OLAW, which we already discussed, about the FDA and the CDC. At the bottom of the slide, there are the different logos, the USDA and OLAW, which we've mentioned, but we also have, because we are in New York State, we also have to obey Department of Health regulations as well. And a lot of times, all of these are kind of encompassed together, but there are cases where we have to specify things differently. So the key part of the 1985 update and why that's especially important for us is because it does add OLAW, and which covers covers things such as birds and rodents, which were accepted previously by USDA, but OLAW covers them now, and that means that the NIH is involved in overseeing the use of those animals. And that means, of course, if NIH is overseeing them, that means we, meaning the university, is getting funding from the NIH, which we are, certainly, then we must obey these federal regulations. Again, all of these, the Animal Welfare Act was developed because to create the legal basis for oversight. It defines things such as the size of a cage for a particular, whatever animal it might be, the cleanliness needed for the cage, that you can't just ignore the conditions, and all aspects of well-being, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So it really lays out the fact that we must treat the animals providing them with a habitat and with interactions that are as most similar to them naturally as possible. Checking, no questions. Right.
There are no questions at this time in the chat.
All right.
Thank you.
So again, to summarize, how do things fall in terms of the regulatory components of OLAW and APHIS? So again, the two components from the federal level, NIH as well as the USDA, they require OLAW and APHIS, the NIH and the USDA require that we have an institutional assurance, an institutional official, and an IACUC. And these are things that are the institutional official and IACUC are actually written in the laws that have been developed and implemented in the United States. The institutional assurance is our plan. It's our detailed plan that we have to have that says, here's what we do to comply with all of the regulations that exist relating to animal research and teaching. So the institutional assurance is the plan that we must have. The institutional official is ultimately the person who signs off and says, yes, indeed, everything we do here obeys and follows the laws according to our institutional assurance. And then institutional official is I am the institutional official for UB. So ultimately, it is my responsibility to make sure that things are getting done properly so that we can say that indeed we are obeying the laws. And then we have the IACUC. And the IACUC is, as we mentioned, it's the committee that ensures that day-to-day activities that go on follow the guidelines and meet and follow our institutional assurance. So the IACUC is the one who reviews the protocol that you submit to say, hey, I'm doing this kind of research. The IACUC also oversees the animal facilities to say, are you treating animals properly? Are the facilities maintained? Are you changing the water in the cages, et cetera, et cetera? The IACUC is the one responsible for oversight of the day-to-day activities in the animal facilities and with all researchers involved with animals. So these three things, because we have these three entities in the middle, having those things in place, we have an institutional assurance, we have an institutional official that says, yes, indeed, we're doing this, and we have an IACUC in place that says, yes, we're doing the right things. Because we have these, we are able to receive federal funding from many different agencies, not just NIH, but also, for example, the USDA. It could be from a National Science Foundation. It could be from the DoD. It could be from NASA. Any federally funded research where we receive funding, we are able to do this because we can say, yes, we have these things in place. Without these, we are unable to receive federal funding. We'd also, as I mentioned on the previous slide, so the previous slide where, again, I said I had the New York State Department of Health on the bottom, as their logo is there. That's not showing up here, but again, the Department of Health, we do get annual certification from them to perform live animal studies, again, because we have to fill out a set of reports for them. So as I mentioned, if OLAW says that we need to meet certain requirements and based on the laws to be able to be involved with animal research, what we have done is we have allowed the ALAC International. It stands for, again, Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care. I don't always remember the entire acronym, but that's why I just go with ALAC. But it is a private nonprofit organization that promotes the humane treatment of animals in science through voluntary accreditation and assessment programs. So we do not have to go to ALAC to do anything. We do because we know that that is the standard for what is done, just like many programs, many educational programs all over the university has accrediting boards. ALAC is one of these accrediting boards for animal use in research. So we have said, yes, we will allow ALAC to come and inspect and make sure that we meet the requirements for OLAW. So there's a process, and our program is, our animal research program is accredited by ALAC. Reaccreditation occurs every 3 years. What we do is every 3 years, we have to submit a new report to the ALAC. Once we've submitted the report, we schedule a site visit. They come and they spend multiple days here going through the facilities, reading documents, talking to people. And eventually, the goal is that to be reaccredited. And actually, this is currently 2025 is a reaccreditation year. So we have just submitted our report to ALAC about March, so about a month, just under a month ago, we submitted the report, and we're in the process of scheduling their accreditation visit over the next few days, or for the next few weeks. I mean, a few days. I would be too nervous. Over the next few weeks. So again, we do this because, again, once we're accredited, then what it says is we can say to OLAW, indeed, everything that we're supposed to be doing, we're doing. So we've been affiliated with ALAC since 1966. And the key thing is that, and what should be understood as that this is essentially self-reporting, self-inspection, and self-compliance. Because nobody from outside of UB can be here every day checking on everything. So what ALAC says is, do you have the processes and procedures in place? Do you have the facilities that are well maintained, et cetera, so that you're able to document if something does go wrong, and things do eventually go wrong, because as much as we are trying to do the right thing, humans are humans. Sometimes a mistake is made. The goal is to say, if something happens, do we handle it properly to make sure that it doesn't happen again? So that's the self-inspection that we have to go through. We also have the USDA, again, as a separate piece. The USDA does inspect on an annual basis. They do an annual inspection, not quite as detailed because of the types of things they're looking for, but they're on an annual basis, or they may come through more frequently if that's needed. But again, ALAC is what we use to be accredited, and that tells OLAW that that we are, and the USDA that we are, we have the proper processes in place, and we meet the regulations. So briefly, that's the background for kind of the regulatory component. This again, to recap, society has determined that we treat animals properly, that we provide as much care to them as possible, to treat them as humanely as possible, and that we justify our use of them in our research and our teaching because they do not have the ability to consent. There are laws that govern this activity, and there are processes in place to ensure that we follow those laws. That's what we know to this point. So part 2 gets into a little bit more detail about the IACUC and then also the investigator responsibility. So now we've set up the structure for how we handle the regulatory and ethical components. But now, how do we get into actually the details of actually doing this? So the IACUC, or IACUCs in general, are local institutional committees with federal mandates. Again, as I said, the IACUC is spelled out. We have to have something that's called, it doesn't have to be called IACUC, but it has to be essentially the IACUC at our university, according to the federal laws, overseeing and doing the following. This is what the IACUC must do. They must review animal protocols and changes to these protocols. In other words, the animal protocol, again, is what you as a researcher is saying you're going to do. How are you going to involve animals in your research? That's your protocol. And any changes have to be reviewed. They have to evaluate the institutional compliance with the public health policy, the USDA and Animal Welfare Act regulations, and our own institutional policies that we may have. The IACUC monitors institutional animal care and use programs, which includes inspecting these facilities. So again, the IACUC is responsible for going to the animal facilities and actually seeing that things are done properly. They also review concerns about animal care or use. There is anonymous reporting that is available to people who are involved with the animal facilities to say, oh, I believe that something is not being done correctly. And the IACUC has a responsibility for investigating those to either determine whether that's a real concern or if it's not a concern, or maybe it's a misunderstanding, whatnot, but they must review that. And then if something is non-compliant with what we said we would be doing, non-compliance meaning something happening that was not supposed to happen, then this has to be reported to the NIH Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. That's OLAW. So these non-compliances have to be reported, and we do those. Again, non-compliance does occur. We try to obviously prevent them from occurring, by doing all of these different processes, but eventually something does happen at various times. So we do address these, and we must send all of this information to the NIH. So who is on the IACUC? The IACUC committee is composed of at least 5 members, and they must have at least one of the following. Again, these are not options. These are requirements. Must have a veterinarian on the committee, a researcher who has experimental expertise, in other words, someone who might be a PI and been doing research, must have a non-scientist, in other words, somebody who is, it could be maybe a lawyer, it could be a philosopher, it could be who knows, somebody who does not have a scientific background in general, and somebody who is non-affiliated with the university, in other words, a community person. So it could be just somebody who does not have any sort of connection to the university other than working with the IACUC. So those are 4 people that have to be on the committee, and then there's another person who could be in any of these categories. So the goal is that you have scientific expert, you have a veteran, both in terms of doing research with the animals, you have an expert who is an animal care person, a veterinarian, and then you have people who come at this with a completely different view to provide their reviewing. And this is, again, the committee that will be reviewing the protocols that you submit. So the IACUC committee has a chairperson who organizes and runs things, and also there are alternate members that will be on the committee. In other words, we'll have to have an alternate for, say, one of the researchers. In case one of the researchers can't make a particular meeting to review, that person has a direct alternate involved. And then we also, as necessary, there are non-voting consultants that might be added. For example, someone from environmental health and safety may be invited to come to talk about some part of an animal protocol. Someone from biosafety, potentially, if it's involving, if the animal protocol is involving a particular antibiotic or a virus or something. So we may involve, as part of the committee, there might be other people, but these other people that we do bring in would not be voting members. The others, at least 5 committee members are voting. So keep in mind that the IACUC are guided by 3 R's. These are the core principles of replacement, reduction, and refinement. So these 3 R's have been in place for a long time, although they've kind of shifted a little bit over time in terms of the wording. They might have been a little bit simpler. They've kind of gotten a little bit more nuanced, I'd say, over time. So the first one is replacement. What that means is, if it's possible to use some sort of advanced technologies to do the experiments so that you don't have to use animal models, use animals in your research, that should be done wherever possible. So that's always the starting point, is like, do we really need to use an animal to do this study? Could we use something else instead? And, something I make on my bench top and use that to test the drug instead. Is that feasible? Is that realistic? If it's yes, then that should be done. So that's the number one, is do we really need to use the animal? Can we replace the animal with something else other than an animal? It's not always possible, but that's the starting point. Reduction. In other words, reduce the number of animals that are needed in the experiments. That's not to say that you should have 1 if you need 10. Okay, because the reduction means properly size experiments. Use the proper number of animals to obtain meaningful results. What you don't want to do is, you don't want to say, well, I want to minimize the number of animals I use, therefore I'm only going to use 3, but then you don't get any meaningful results. So those 3 have provided no value. that have not, the three have not offset the cost of using those animals if you get no meaningful results. So it's not that you should use the minimum, it's that you should use the minimum necessary to get meaningful results. So that's part of what the IACUC looks at as well, is did you design your experiment to come to this level of meaningful numbers? And then refinement, which is to make sure that your procedure, that your protocol that you're using, developing, uses procedures that minimize pain and distress as much as possible. So with these three R's are really what the IACUC is guided by to try to ensure that that animals are used properly and we're meeting the very core of treating animals well. Okay, boy, this is a very busy slide, but this is also a document which is available, and there is a link down here below from the website. You can actually download this investigators need to know.pdf from OLAW. So this is actually something which is available, and I put it up because it's actually it's a one-page PDF that really has a lot of good information on it. So we're going to kind of step through, not read off of this slide, but step through components of this so that we cover the important points. So again, this is the link to the previous slide. Again, olaw.nih.gov. Oh, super, thank you. The link is in chat. I was not smart enough to get that ready ahead of time. And then also everything you need to know about everything you need to know about satisfying IACUC protocol requirements, again, is another publication that's available through PubMed, and you can download that. It's again a handy guide to being able to look and provide some background information on developing IACUC protocols. So we'll start up here in the upper corner about this in this document. Principal investigators are responsible for. So just taking that big chunk of text. Principal investigators are responsible for the scientific and technical aspects of a grant award and must ensure in compliance with Public Health Service policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals when using live vertebrate animals. PHS policy incorporates U.S. government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals used in testing, research, and training, which is also called the guide. That's how people in this area refer to it, as the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals. And the American Veterinary Medical Association guides for the euthanasia of animals. Vertebrate animals must include traditional laboratory animals. Vertebrate animals include traditional laboratory animals, farm animals, wildlife, and aquatic animals. And this covers teaching, research, or testing. And the generation of custom antibodies is considered an activity involving vertebrate animals. So this is saying principal investigators are responsible for that their research complies with PHS policies, all of the stuff that we already talked about. PIs, you as a researcher, must comply with all of these things. How do you know you're complying with all of those? Did you read all of those policies? Well, part of what that is, and part of why the IACUC is here, part of why I am here, is to say we have a system in place to make sure you do follow these rules and they are in compliance. So your protocol that you're developing to be able to do research with animals must comply with these policies. Therefore, the IACUC will review it to ensure that it's in compliance with these policies. And if you do something that's not in your protocol, that's not supposed to be allowed, then that's when there are non-compliance issues that occur that we have to report to OLAW, and we have to account for those, and we have to make amends for those. So going back to this main slide here is, again, as we're coming from this the first box, what are the U.S. government policies, principles? I'm sorry, from from the bolded text, we say U.S. government principles. What are these? These are the transportation, care, and use of animals in accordance with the Animal Welfare Act, as we already talked about, that AWA from 1966 and 1985, and as well as other federal laws, guidelines, and policies. These are the government principles that we must be in compliance with, following. Procedures involving animals should be designed performed with due consideration of their relevance to human or animal health, because again, we tend to think a lot about doing this research just because of where we are at UB, is involving animal research to develop something that will be impacting humans. But there certainly is research that goes on in animals to develop treatments for animals, right? So that certainly is true. So the relevance to human or animal health, the advancement of knowledge, or the good of society. The animals selected for a procedure should be of appropriate species, quality, and minimum number required to obtain valid results. Methods such as mathematical models, computer simulation, and in vitro biological systems should be considered as alternates if possible. So in the number 1 bullet, all aspects of animal use are addressed in the Animal Welfare Act. Number 2 is animals must be deemed worthwhile. There must be benefit to using animals to offset the actual use. And 3 is we must consider the alternatives. Choose the correct method, have scientific justification for why. First, consider non-animal use if possible. So this, again, jumping backward, I apologize for the jumping back and forth, but again, policy says that incorporates U.S. government principles, and these are the principles that it's talking about. Also, proper use of animals, including minimizing or avoiding discomfort, strain, distress, or pain. Procedures with animals that may cause more than momentary or slight or pain or distress should be performed with appropriate sedation and analgesia or anesthesia. Surgical or other painful procedures should not be performed on non-anesthetized animals paralyzed by chemical agents. So again, these are details that are saying, how are we doing our research? How do we minimize pain and distress? What can we do? We should use the best methods for trying to minimize these. And this is the refinement process of one of the 3 R's. For number 4, the key here is that animals, again, are better at hiding their pain or distress, or tend to be good at it. So some of the way we think about it is that, oh, would I want this done to me? And would it cause me pain or distress? Yes. Okay, well then, how do you deal with that in an animal? The same is going to be true. For number 5 here, again, you should provide relief as much as possible. And if you can't provide that, if you can't provide sedation or you can't provide analgesia, in other words, if you can't give them a Tylenol, not that you would, but the equivalent of giving the animal the Tylenol, if you can't do that, then you have to justify why. Well, we know that this medication that would reduce pain impacts in a negative way what we're trying to elicit, which is using this other drug that we're testing. We know that there's a negative interaction which will cause more problems. Therefore, I cannot do it. Here's the reason. Here's the citations for why. So the key is that you're documenting and justifying what you're doing. And number 6, animals that would otherwise suffer severe or chronic pain or distress that cannot be relieved should be painlessly killed at the end of the procedure, or if appropriate, during the procedure. In other words, an approved euthanasia method must be defined and clearly spelled out in your protocol, which depends on the species and age of the animal. And again, this has to be justified scientifically. And the whole point here is that minimizing pain and distress. So all parts of your protocol must be spelled out in terms of not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and how are you dealing with these other issues to minimize pain and distress. Continuing the U.S. government principles, Living conditions must be appropriate for the species and contribute to their health and comfort. Normally, the housing, feeding, and care of all animals used for biomedical purposes must be directed by a veterinarian or other scientist trained in the experience and proper care, handling, and use of these species. In any case, a veterinary care shall be provided as indicated. So again, these are the government principles saying part of this, the Animal Welfare Acts, etc., saying if you're using animals to do research, they must be cared for properly. Health and comfort, proper housing and feeding, water, etc., monitored by a veterinarian. All of these things, of course, we do provide at the university. We do have an animal facility that we have veterinarians on staff. We have other lab technicians. But keep in mind that the researcher is responsible for these as well. It's not something that's just completely handed off to the animal facility. That the researchers are involved as well. And number 8, which is in gray, but for no reason. Investigators and other personnel shall be appropriately qualified and experienced for conducting procedures on living animals. Adequate arrangements shall be made for the in-service training, including proper and humane care and use of laboratory animals. So what this is saying is that training is required based on the animal species involved. This includes the lab personnel and the PIs. So our people that work in the animal facilities to take care of the animals are trained. Folks who are involved with research, such as you on this meeting, doing the research, you must also go through training to make sure that you understand how to properly treat and care for the animals. The PI, your faculty supervisor may also be one who's providing some training, maybe for potentially specific protocols that involve some of their own specific research. That's also possible. And then number 9, where exceptions are required in relation to the provision of all these principles, the decisions should not rest with the investigators directly concerned, but should be made with due regard to Principle 2 by an IACUC. Such exceptions should not be made solely for the purposes of teaching or demonstration. So in other words, if certain aspects cannot be met because of the need for doing the research that's justifiable, the IACUC is the group that makes that determination whether that's allowed. And it doesn't mean that they will make that allowed, but they are the one that has to make the determination. So it is up to the researchers to just state why and clearly justify why and back that up with data about why these this investigation must happen, why this research must go on in the way that it's being defined, that it potentially violates one of these principles, why. It must be justified. So, for example, proper care and feeding of a mouse. Well, my behavioral study is what happens when mice do not get enough water. How do they act? And what we're studying is dehydration impacts on mental processing. So the mouse does not have enough water, and then is supposed to run through a maze, and then another mouse which gets enough water runs through the maze. How do we see a difference? How do we characterize the difference? So the reason that we need to have not appropriate care and feeding, watering for this mouse is because that is the experiment. But why is it necessary? Why do we need to do this experiment? So part of this has to be justified. So again, before we get into this slide, the guide, so I'm jumping back to, whoops, sorry, too far here. PHS policy incorporates U.S. government principles, which we just talked about. The guide, which is the next one. So this is the guide for the care and use of animals. So the guide for animal use programs, this guide is what is used by IACUCs to help follow these principles. And you can download this for free. I don't have the link here for some reason. I think I must have it at the end of all of this, but you can download this guide as well. It's free. PDF version is free. You can purchase a hard copy if you'd like, but this PDF is free. Again, consider the alternatives design and performance of procedures based on the basis of relevance, in other words, justification, the use of appropriate species, the number and the type of animals, the avoidance or minimization of stress and discomfort, the appropriate use of sedation, as we talked about, the establishment of humane endpoints, provision of adequate veterinary care, provision of appropriate animal transportation and husbandry performed by qualified people if needed, and conduction of experiments on living animals exclusively and or under the supervision of qualified and experienced personnel. So you can see all of these here basically mirror the guidelines, or the government principles that we just mentioned. And these are all outlined and detailed in this guide for the care and use of laboratory animals. So if we dig into a little bit into the guide, what it talks about is must, should, and may. In the guide, the musts say that this is the IACUC must consider these things, that they're imperative and mandatory. Should indicates a strong recommendation for achieving a goal. However, the IACUC has some leeway to just say, hey, maybe we have to do something different. May is something that is a suggestion that should be considered. And the key things about the guide is that its recommendations can be applied in various settings. So it's not just set up so that only potentially the most sophisticated research labs can implement all of these requirements. It's not that. It's that it's understood that there are going to be various types of facilities, various types of research, teaching, and testing sites. And that ultimately the IACUCs have a key role in interpretation, implementation, and oversight of all of these animal care and use programs. So going back to this, the one page, we'll jump to the next, which is who must comply with the PHS policy. And the humane care and use of laboratory animals policy, again, who must comply with that? It applies to extramural and intramural activities. So what this means is that it applies to extramural, meaning funded research, such as research funding that the University of Buffalo gets from NIH and other agencies, as well as intramural activities, which is research that the NIH does itself within its own entity. So for us, it's really just the extramural part. And it applies to the NIH, obviously, as I said, the FDA, Centers for Disease Control, and the Department of Health and Human Services. All funding mechanisms, no matter what type of a grant it is, training grant, research grant, whatever, are all covered by the policy, whether it's being done here or at some other university that's not within the U.S. And then finally, because and certainly particularly important to us, because we do have ongoing research with the Department of Veteran Affairs, or the VA, NASA, and National Science Foundation. They're all covered through agreements with the NIH. So basically any of these research activities where we receive funding, and we receive funding from every one of these entities on this slide, so we say that we must be compliant. So again, the PHS policy says that we must comply, UB must comply, because we receive funding from these agencies, and we must comply, meaning the faculty and the researchers, the students, everybody must comply with these policies. And that is, again, why we have all of these processes in place to ensure that this happens. So again, what is an IACUC? We kind of talked about that already. What are the investigators' responsibilities? Okay, the IACUC we already talked about, so we'll just jump over that. The investigator responsibilities. What are the investigator responsibilities? Investigators are accountable for the protection of the research animals in their care from the earliest stages of planning until a study is completed, which includes describing proposed use of animals in grant applications, the very start. Okay, you don't even have funding yet to carry out the research, but you're writing your proposal to get funding. You must be describing in detail in the grant application how you're using animals, how you plan to use animals. You'll have to obtain IACUC approval prior to using animals and prior to implementing significant changes to your protocol. So in other words, if you submit a research proposal to the NIH, and also by extension, as we said, to NSF or NASA or whomever, you submit your proposal, you have to describe the use of the animals, and then they say, congratulations, you got the grant, hooray. But before we'll give you the money, you have to give us you have to show us that your animal research has been approved by your IACUC. So before you can even start, you have to make sure that you have IACUC approval. So what does that mean? That means generally you don't have to have IACUC approval when you submit your grant, but after you've submitted, you should have your protocol in place and ready to be approved by IACUC when your funding is approved. So there's always the delay between time you submit your proposal to the time it's funded. There's generally months, so that gives plenty of time for IACUC approval to be obtained. And then ensuring that research is conducted according to the protocol. Again, the protocol is what you have written up to send to the IACUC to tell them, hey, here's what I'm going to do. Here's why we should do it. Here's the reasons for doing it. Here's all the justifications. Here are the alternatives to doing it this way. How else could it be done? And here's why those don't work here. So all of this is part of your protocol that you submit, and then you have to make sure that you're following that protocol and you comply with all the institutional policies and procedures that we have. And all of these are documents. All of these are available online on our website. There's many, many, many of them. And then you also have to address significant changes to the use of animals in progress reports. Whether you change how many animals you're using, you're changing part of some of the processes, some of the steps. Maybe you're changing a drug. Maybe you're adding this, you're subtracting that. You have to make sure that you're always making anything you vary from your protocol, you have to get approval for that before you do it. And also changes in the use of the animals that may be a potential change in scope, which includes changing the performance site where the experiments may be occurring. So it's key to note here that we don't, whether your funding is coming from the NIH or NSF or from the CDC or from whoever, we do not use a different set of policies because we are compliant through OLAW and ALAC accreditation, et cetera. We use the same policies no matter who the funding agency is, unless the agency has something specific that is required. And then there's also, so the previous are the investigator responsibilities to the NIH, but then there are also researchers' ethical responsibility. Researchers who study vertebrate animals have a primary responsibility to their students, peers, institution, government agencies, society, and the animals they study to do their work humanely. This goes back to the beginning, as we talked about, in terms of making sure that you are being ethical in terms of your use of animals. Fulfilling this responsibility requires a commitment to learning about relevant principles, keeping current with policy changes, and considering the moral and legal dimensions of your actions as a researcher. It's not always easy to stay current with policies. They don't change that much, but we do have a newsletter that comes from the LAF, that comes from the IACUC. We do provide updates when there are key things that do change, so you're not on your own to try to keep track of that. So applying for funding, the next box. So when you're applying for funding, part of what you have to do is you must provide a concise description of the proposed procedure involving a vertebrate animal that includes things such as the species, the strain, the ages of the animals you're using, the sex, and the number of animals that you're going to use. You have to justify that the species you're using is appropriate for the proposed research and explaining why the research goals cannot be accomplished using an alternative model. As we mentioned, you must justify why the animals must be used, why these particular animals must be used, and why there is not an alternative that works. You also have to describe the interventions that include any sort of analgesia, anesthesia, sedation, etc., and humane endpoints to minimize discomfort, pain, distress, and injury. Indication of that the euthanasia method is consistent with the guidelines or describe and scientifically justify if it is not. If there is some reason why it cannot follow the AVMA guidelines, then it has to be very clearly justified. Very often this becomes a key issue when going through protocol review, and of course it will be brought up when your grant is being reviewed. It's different. So the next box is obtaining IACUC approval. No, that's why. So obtaining IACUC approval is required, as I said, prior to the award, except in very rare circumstances. Your IACUC will require you to submit information about the care and use of animals on a protocol form. That is what we've talked about, the protocol. Most animal protocols require a description of the following elements. Research project overview. What is your project? What are you doing? Rationale for using animals, consideration of alternatives, justification of the choice of species and number of animals, the research procedures that you're carrying out, procedures to minimize pain and distress, animal living conditions and veterinary care, names and qualifications of personnel who will perform the work with the animals. In other words, the people who will be involved, who are the researchers who will be in the lab working with the animals, and the method of euthanasia and endpoint criteria. Again, all these may look repetitive. It looks like already you provided this information in your research proposal, which is exactly true. But this is what the IACUC must see in order to make a determination whether your research is acceptable and meets the criteria to be justified as animal research. And it has to be essentially congruent with the description in the grant application. In other words, you can't have your grant say, I'm going to do X, and then your IACUC protocol says, I'm going to do Y. So therefore, once you get the IACUC approval approved, you can't actually carry out the research that you proposed. You have to have agreement that you're proposing to do the same thing, and that you're telling the IACUC that you're doing the same thing. And the key thing is that it does happen. Maybe not 100% of the time, but 90% of the time, or more, there's some modification. You start doing the research and you see, oh, we thought everything we said led to this, but now no one's seen something like this happen before. We've got to change something. So you have to submit a protocol change to the IACUC saying, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what we're doing. Here's something that's changing. Here's why we're changing it. Here's what we're doing differently, etc. And you have to get that approved before you do that. Some things as simple as a student who's working on your protocol graduated, finished their PhD, and is leaving. But now you need someone else to come in and start working. So a new person has to be added to the protocol. That simple, yes, the IACUC has to be informed of that change. That's a very simple change, assuming that the person has gone through the appropriate training, etc. It's usually very simple. That's an easy change. Others maybe not as easy or as simple, but again, any changes to the protocol must be submitted to the IACUC for approval. So again, another useful document for writing grant applications and involving vertebrate animals. And again, everything you need to know about satisfying IACUC protocol requirements that we referenced earlier. Okay, so we went from who's supposed to comply, what's the IACUC thing anyway, what is my responsibility, what do I do when I'm applying for funding, what do I need to do about obtaining IACUC approval. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. That's the same thing anyway. So receiving an award, there's not a lot there other than what the university has to do from their end. So post-award and process and requirement. So what goes on there? Well, once you get your award and you start working on the research and you're doing the research, maybe it's a multi-year, or most likely will be a multi-year funding award. IACUC review is required at least every 3 years, or it's an annual review if it's something that falls under USDA regulations. If it's a type of animal that's regulated by the USDA, it's a yearly review. If it's another type of animal, for example, mice, involves every 3 years. So your protocol gets reviewed and approved when your grant starts. Great, you start carrying out the research, and then 3 years later, you're required to go through a review again. Again, any changes to animal care and use are to be approved by the IACUC prior to you doing them. And it's always the best thing to do is if you're thinking of changing something, check with the IACUC. Again, pretty much anything that's significant and almost any change really needs to be approved. Some very minor things such as changing personnel, again, can be handled very quickly. Something that we will never do, or you will never do, of course, is conduct research in the absence of IACUC approval if you're using animals, or implementing a significant change with IACUC approval. Those types of things are non-compliance. Non-compliance are things that we have to report to OLAW. It involves me being involved, writing letters, sending emails, documenting what happened, you meeting with the IACUC, explaining what happened, why did it happen, what are you doing to prevent it from happening again. Lots of time and effort. Aside from the fact, and that is just the kind of the bureaucratic side, of course, what can happen with these non-compliance is that it actually impacts the animals in a negative way. That's the most important component that we don't want to have happen. And you cannot use your grant money to pay for any of these activities if it's not permitted, or if they're not permitted without IACUC approval. In other words, if you haven't obtained IACUC approval, or if the protocol is expired, or for some reason if it was suspended by the IACUC for non-compliance issues. So in other words, you're carrying out research, there's something that happens that puts you into non-compliance. You're basically then, that means nothing can be charged to the grant to pay for your animals and the research until the non-compliance is removed and that IACUC says, yes, you can continue to do your research. So the best thing to do is to do things properly so that you don't run into those issues. So again, that brings us from pre-award to post-award, carrying out the research. Of course, receiving the award there's not a lot, again, as I mentioned, other than that for the receiving the award, it's primarily on the fact that the funding agencies will look to make sure that things are properly documented from the university. That's not within your purview. You would assume that has happened, and if it hasn't happened, then that's my fault. Okay. So it gets us into the part 3, which is the last. There's part 4, which is just a summary of the references, etc. But part 3 is our final stage. So this is a little bit more for the just questions, and you can put answers. You can respond in chat if you'd like to. Perfectly fine. So scenario number 1 is you're trying to select the appropriate animal model. So you want to justify why this appropriate animal model meets the aims of the study. And the key thing is that it requires a scientific justification. So what would be what would be a perfectly fine justification? Would we say that, sorry, my animation did not work appropriately. Is the least expensive method to do the research? Is that a good answer to provide? Obviously, the answer is no. Provided the answer as well as the response, right? So there's no saying it's the least expensive method for carrying out the research is not a justifiable reason. The least sentient animal, yes, that is a justifiable reason. It may not be the only reason, but the least sentient is always what we strive for. Related to the least expensive is that it's prohibitively expensive to do something different. Is that justifiable? I'm using mice to do this because it would be too expensive to do it using some other method. Is that justifiable? Maybe. It's a tough call, but if you can justify that scientifically, then that might be allowed. Is it the most convenient method? Again, that's a very, very tough one, but that may be, because convenient is not by itself the right way to approach it, but it's much more of, it is a method that is justifiable scientifically, and you'd have to back it up. I would not go into an argument with, oh, it's the most convenient thing to do. So before I slide to the next, to the answer to this, who determines the scientific merit or the benefit of a project? Anyone want to pop an answer in? Who determines this? You can have a one-word answer if you want.
You can also unmute and you can say something if you want to.
Sure.
Who determines the scientific merit or the benefit of a project? What do you think? Anyone have a response? Not seeing anything.
So I'll try to tease out an answer. So let's say it's not one person. Maybe it's a group of 5 people who might have an answer then, if it's a group of 5 people that determines the merits or benefit of the project.
The committee is what someone said.
How about more specifically? I think you're on the right. The
IACUC committee is what they said.
IACUC. Thank you. Yes. The IACUC determines assures a merit. So it is the IACUC that is correct. However, of course, it's never always that simple. The IACUC will often, the scientific merit, the IACUC may rely on peer review. In other words, the IACUC may say, oh, this has been reviewed by an NIH panel or an NSF panel or CDC or somebody else. Other peer review has already reviewed this. Other scientific experts have already reviewed this. So they will trust that result. If it's non-funded or potentially self-funded research, that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult for the IACUC to determine. So then there's other things, no peer review, and then that's where you need other types of review. That's where the IACUC will then rely on, because it's very possible, even though the IACUC itself has expertise, they may not have expertise on the committee that deals with, say, a specific microbe that you are trying to look at involved with a particular species of rat. That may not be there. So there will be, if there's no peer review involved, then it may be a department head, department chair, or independent review, or the PI can also provide sufficient detail in the proposal, in the protocol, to be able to make that judgment. So the key thing is that the IACUC does determine scientific merit. They tend to use peer review as the key driver to determine that, and if there isn't, then they will be asking for other information. Oh, that's not supposed to. Oh. Right. So, oops, I don't want to jump ahead too fast here. So again, the scientific and merit. So it's the study that must be scientifically valuable and not unnecessarily duplicative. again, okay, this is again going back to the scientific merit. Who's determining this? The IACUC, and what would they be looking for if they do not have a peer review response? Then what they're looking at are things like it's scientifically valuable and not unnecessarily duplicative. In other words, you're not trying to reproduce the results of somebody else, but rather you're trying to do this to say, oh, they did this, but then we're going to do this differently because we're going to try to get it something else. Must be justified. Again, consistent with sound research design and relevance to human or animal health. Again, the justification. And the IACUC would also be evaluating scientific elements of the protocol. In other words, hypothesis testing, sample size, group numbers, controls, etc. These all things which you would also be specifying in your research proposal if it were peer reviewed. So for unexpected adverse events, what needs to happen? If there's an unexpected adverse event, when should this be reported? Something happens that you did not expect. When should it be reported?
Feel free to type it in the chat or unmute. When should oh, here we go. Immediately is what some people are saying.
I just tapped my keyboard. Yes. As soon as early deaths or health problems are observed. Yes. As soon as you notice something, it should be reported. I accidentally hit my touchpad to make that come out, but yes, as soon as a death or a health problem is observed, it should be reported to. You want to report it to the animal facilities where the animals are being cared for, so that they know what's going on, and also you need to report it to the IACUC immediately. Is correct.
And this person got the immediately in before you actually pressed that, so that's
right. I think I saw it pop up in the corner of my eye just as I touched my. So the key thing is that there has never been an experiment that has gone perfectly. I would say that if that were the case, then it would be phenomenal. As much as we really, really, really do try, but not all. Just because it doesn't go perfectly doesn't mean that there are always adverse events that occur. But many times something does happen for whatever reason, and when they do occur, the key is that it's reported as soon as possible so the IACUC can document this. Things can be checked out. It could be something it could be something that wasn't even due to anybody's fault, but rather it was a mouse that was ill. Nobody noticed it, and the mouse died because it was ill, and it had determined to be no cause, nothing related to the research going on. Okay, it's documented, but it has so that is not necessarily a non-compliance. An adverse event is not necessarily a non-compliance, but if it goes unreported, it then can become non-compliance.
Right, and we have about 6 minutes remaining, so I'm going to tell people that if you would really have a question, please type it in the chat to make sure we can address your questions.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
So the key thing then is if something unexpected happens, should you end the study or not? That's then what the real question. That's really where the determination needs to come in, and that's why reporting it and getting input and having discussion and bringing it up with the IACUC, discussing it with people in the facility, animal facility. Maybe you have to change your protocol to address this. Maybe you have to do different things. So that's the key question. Again, unexpected deaths or other, as I said, must be occurred. Repeating this must be reported to the IACUC. Again, not all of these result in non-compliance, but they must be reported. And if they don't get reported and found out, which they will, then that will result in non-compliance. So what happens if a proposed protocol will likely produce pain, but analgesics may interfere with the study design? What should be done?
Again, please feel free to type it in the chat or unmute.
Be done if it's likely something's going to produce pain, but you can't give them analgesics to reduce the pain. What do you need to do?
I'll answer this one. Shouldn't that be put in the protocol ahead of time to make sure that they review that to determine whether it is appropriate?
That is correct. must require a scientific justification in your protocol before you're carrying out the study. It is possible, and there are many studies that are done where analgesics are not, they interfere with the drug, etc. So there needs a justification of why you can't do it, and then you must consider other ways to reduce the pain and discomfort. Maybe food, maybe give them, lots of ice cream or something like that, or to make them feel better. Maybe not ice cream, but other types of food that give them comfort, give them a cushy bed, things like that will improve comfort levels, but because it's not available. But it requires a scientific justification, and then also how do you minimize that? And again, it's the part of this is the documentation, provide all additional support. So if it's something to produce pain, the key thing is how much is associated with it, and what is the ethical cost of the study, and how will the ethical cost be minimized? So again, how do we minimize the amount of discomfort, the distress, and how associated with the study, and is it justifiable? Okay. And again, what the IACUC will look at is weighing the potential value versus the distress to the animal. So when we haven't used an animal disease model being used to test new possible treatments, what we want to be looking at this isn't so much a question that I'm asking, as we're just about out of time here, is that what is allowed when we're doing this? What would be allowed in animals? What would we do in humans? So the key thing is consider the controls and endpoints when you're using a disease model to test new treatments. Again, a disease model meaning that we're inducing a disease in the animal, and we're trying to develop something that we think will treat the disease, but we know that we also have to have controls that mean that they're not going to be treated. Is that allowable? What are the endpoints? How do we justify this? And what are the benefits and cost going to be? So again, not so much of a question, but the key point is, if you see something, say something. The key component here is that there are ethical reasons for seeing, you saw something going on in the lab and you don't think that that's right. You should say something about it. There certainly are it's not that it's trivial, but that it's because you may be talking about, it could be your supervisor who's doing something you didn't think was right. That may be ramifications there, but also if you don't say something, it could be that somebody doesn't realize they're doing something wrong, or didn't realize they grabbed the wrong container of something. There are risks all the way around of not speaking up or speaking up. So, but the important thing is that if it seems like something is amiss, say something. If you feel uncomfortable reporting it directly to the person who you're reporting to, report it to other staff to help get their input. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding. It's not something, maybe it's okay, but the key thing is that if you see something, say something. Okay? Because again, you're concerned about the welfare and the risk to the animals, that you're trying to minimize that.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask. You want to do this first, and then
I think we'll stop there, and we'll just go to, again. There's the web sources, which we don't need to go through because we've gone through those a number of times, and those will be available afterwards.
Great, and they do have a copy of the PDF of your slides, or at least I put it in the chat. Great. If anybody has any questions, I don't see any in the chat at this time. Please remain and go ahead and ask it. If not, feel free to sign off. And we thank you very much for coming to this installment of the Responsible Conduct of Research workshop series. And thank you very much, Dr. Titus, for all the interesting information. Something very, very important if you plan on doing animal research at any time. And realize that you have to do the animal research before you do human research many times, and minimize the animals whenever possible if you can use other forms of research instead. So I think that was great. I know Dr. Halverson last year did talk about make sure you order enough animals, definitely, just like you kind of hit on, so that you can definitely do your study appropriately. So that's really important. And now you hit on that as well. So you don't want too many, but don't get too few because it's going to interfere with your research. I know he was really big on that last year.
Yep.
Thank you.
Properly sizing, yes.
Yes, exactly. So incredibly important. Great. And if they have questions about things like that, are there people that they can contact? Or should they just go to those resources?
So any questions about so anything that's about the issues of compliance? Oh, is this something that should I do this or that regarding a protocol? That is IACUC, an IACUC at buffalo.edu is an email. And then if it's an animal specific question, then that is the animal facility. And actually, I don't know if I know their address, but certainly if you look at the VPR's website, you go to animal research, you can find the LAF, and there will be a contact person on there for the animal facility, and they can answer any questions about, oh, I'm planning on ordering animals. The earlier you start to plan your animal protocol, the better. If you think you're going to talk to someone tomorrow to start your research next week, that's not going to happen. You need to plan well ahead of time. Planning means success.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And if you are set and you have no questions, feel free to exit. We'll just stand for another minute just to make sure no one has any questions. And thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much for presenting, Dr. Titus.
Sure.
We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chats.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for everybody for attending. Hope that you found it useful.
And they have the slides. That's going to be very helpful because it has all your resources on it. And I think everyone's okay because no one is speaking up. So I think I'm going to end. And thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks. See you later.
Thanks.
Bye.